Before we start this video, a large thank you to Drew, Ignacio, Thomas, a name I unfortunately cannot pronounce. Thank you for support, my friend, Christopher, Stefan, ZRM, and P for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to add our roll and backstep into the game. So let's start by opening up our player controls, and I'm going to make a new action map. I'm going to call mine Player Actions. And then I am going to delete the default input action on it, and I'm going to add a new one. I'm going to make it of type button, the action type. I'm going to call it dodge, and then where the binding is listed, I'm going to make the binding the EAST button on a gamepad, which is the B button on an Xbox controller, and I believe it's the circle button on a PlayStation controller. I'm going to close that and save it. I am then going to open up our player input manager, and I'm going to write a new function. I'm going to call it private void handle dodge input. I call it dodge input and not roll input because if you are moving, it will be a roll. If you are stationary, it will be a backstep. So I am then going to come up to our variables, and I'm going to copy everything on the camera movement input and just paste it above. This is just preference. I'm just moving it around because I like things to be a certain way. So, and then below the player movement input, I'm going to make a new header for, we'll call it, we can call it actions or player actions. Yeah, player action input. So things like rolling and attacking and all that good stuff will be here. So let's make a serializable field so we can see it in the inspector, but we're going to keep it private because we don't need to access it from any other class. A bool for our dodge input. So I'm going to initialize that at false. And then on enable, we are going to basically make it so when we press the EAST button on the gamepad, that this input turns to true. We do that by saying player controls dot player actions dot dodge dot performed plus equals I equals greater than dodge input is equal to true. So basically, when you hit the dodge button, which is the EAST button on the gamepad in our settings, it will turn the dodge input bool to true. Just as simple as that. Okay, so under handle dodge input, we need to say if the dodge input is true, we need to instantly change it back to false so it doesn't repeat this action more than one time. And then we want to perform a dodge. It makes the most sense to me to put this function, the dodge function, on the player locomotion manager. But I'm also going to make a note here before we leave, a future note for future Seb. When we get around to adding the UI, specifically menu windows and equipment interfaces, we don't want to perform a dodge if our UI is open. In Souls and Elden, you can run around while the menu is open, but you can't perform any actions. So I'm just going to make a note here in the future. All right, now let's go and jump over to the Player Locomotion Manager, where we can write the logic for attempting to perform a dodge. We are first going to begin by creating a new function. I'm going to make mine public because it's being accessed from the input manager. And I'm going to call it attempts to perform dodge. I say attempt here because in the future, this will depend on a few things. If you have stamina and if you're performing another action, but right now it's going to be pretty simple, so it's going to be very much more straightforward. I'm going to make a header up here for movement settings. This is going to just contain the rotation speed, the walking speed, the running speed, and all that good stuff. And I'm then going to hide in the inspector my vertical, horizontal, and move mount inputs that are being called from our input manager because I don't need to see them. They're just here so they can be passed on to something else. And then I'm going to make a header for the, I guess I could call this dodge. And I'm going to make a private vector3 for the roll direction. Now, I don't call this dodge direction because this variable is only being used when we are performing a roll, not when we're performing a backstep. So down here under attempt to perform dodge, I'm going to say roll direction is equal to the player camera dot instance dot camera object dot, whoops, that's meant to be transform, dot transform dot forward times, same as before, our vertical movement. So you can do vertical movement, that's listed here, if you went the same route as I did, and you copied the vertical movement from the input manager because you just like to have it here. It doesn't matter. You can also reference the player UI, or sorry, the player input manager dot instance vertical movement. So it's both the same because as I explained in the last video, these inputs are just basically being gathered from the same place. So likewise down here, roll direction plus equals player camera dot instance dot camera object dot transform dot right times either the horizontal input or the player input manager dot instance dot horizontal input. Now, this just comes down to really just a stylized preference. You're going to find that people code different ways. They just like having their things organized in different ways. So whichever one you enjoy more, just use. They're both doing the same thing. Now, right below this, I am going to say, below roll direction, roll direction.y is equal to 0. We don't want to roll up or down, only in a forward, left, and right direction. Next, right below that, we're going to get the rotation of this roll. So we're going to say quaternion. I'm going to call this roll direction. Actually, I'm going to call it player rotation. And what this is basically we're going to get a rotation from the direction we are attempting to roll. We do that by saying quaternion.look rotation, and we pass our roll direction. Now that we have this new rotation, we need to apply it to our player. We do that by saying player, as in the player manager, dot transform, as in the transform of the game object, dot rotation is equal to player rotation, which is new rotation. So what does this do? Oh, let's also normalize this, by the way, before we call the rotation. So just say roll direction dot normalize. This just takes the direction of the roll, rotates us towards that direction, and then we can play the rolling animation. Now, we lastly need to check for if our move amount is greater than 0. Why? Well, if it's greater than 0, we're going to roll. If it's not, then we're stationary, which means we are going to perform a backstep. You could also use player input manager.instance.moveAmount, or you could use the move amount variable that is listed here. It's entirely up to you. I just showed you both because, again, I just want to really nail home the fact that make the coding style your own. Do whatever you feel is neater or more clear to you. Okay, so I'm going to make a comment saying perform a roll animation, and then an additional comment down here for perform a backstep animation. So when we come back and reading this months from now, yes, this is what the animation is called, etc., etc. I'm also going to make an additional comment up here. If we are moving when we attempt to perform a dodge, then we're going to perform a roll. And if we are stationary, we are going to perform a backstep. So that's very clear, very easy to understand. And now we can actually get to the point where we write our function for playing an animation. So luckily, we already have created our script for such a function. It's our character animator manager. So let's go over and open that up. And I'm going to minimize these functions and then write a new one. This will be a general function used for most of our action animations. I'm going to call it public virtual void, so we can override this in the future on the player and AI manager. And I'm going to call it play target action animation. I'm going to require it to pass a string for the animation name, which I will call target animation, and then a bool for is performing action. So what is this bool used for? Well, it's generally a flag on the character, because when you're performing an action, you want to limit what you can do in some capacity, like in terms of movement and performing other actions. I'll expand more upon that momentarily. So let's say character.animator apply root motion, and this is if you want to use the motion from the animation, which we do for things like roll. You can initialize that at performing action if you want to use it for every single animation in your game that is an action animation, or you can give it its own bool for apply root motion. So I'm going to do that. We're going to say equals apply root motion, okay? And then we're going to say character dot animator, as in our animator component, dot crossfade, and we're going to play our target animation, but we're going to blend it over a time of 0.2f. All right, so this flag, so let's say you're rolling. You don't want to be able to roll again mid-roll, because then you could just cancel all of your actions with another action, and that's not what you want to do. So this is what we use is performing action. It basically acts as a flag to stop you from doing certain things and limit your actions and movement. And as you get deeper into this project, you'll notice a lot of actions have exceptions, so we have to add more flags, but a lot of actions will just simply use one general flag. Are you busy? Which is performing action. Okay, if you are, then you can't do anything. And the reason why we're asking for this flag on the play target animation action is because let's say if you get damaged in the future and you don't want to get stun locked, then you would just change is performing action to false. This will allow you to roll out of the animation. So we're going to say character.isPerformingAction is equal to isPerformingAction. Again, I'm going to make a comment here. Can be used to stop character from attempting a new action. And if this is false, then it will not stop your character from attempting certain actions. For example, I'm going to say the same thing I did before. If you get damaged and begin performing an action or a damage animation, this will stop you from doing anything else. Now, if you get damaged again and you're not stun locked and the is performing action bool is set to false, this will allow you to, say, roll out of this animation, and that will allow you to perform another action because you're not stun locked, basically. So this just acts as a gatekeeping bool of sorts to allow or stop certain actions. Okay, so let's save that and go back to the player locomotion manager, and let's just call here where we have perform a roll animation. We simply say player.playerAnimatorManager.play target animation. And I'm going to call mine roll_forward_01. I'm going to say performing action is true, and apply root motion is true by default, but if you want to, you can put a comma and say true again, but it will just be initialized as true by default, see? Okay, so let's go up here again and make a if player dot is performing action return. Now, let's just disable this first because I want to show you what happens if we don't use this. So I'm just going to comment this out because I think it's best to learn by actually seeing and experiencing. So let's save that and let's go back to the player input manager. Under your handle dodge input, let's call our functions. We'll say player.player_locomotion_manager.attempt to perform dodge. Now we need to call the handle dodge input on our update function, but instead of putting everything under update, I'm going to encapsulate it a little bit. I'm going to make a function called handle all inputs, or you can call it tick all input if you want. But I'm just going to put everything that needs to be called every frame inside of here and then call this on update instead. So I'll say handle our camera movement input, and then handle our player movement input, and then handle our dodge input. And then I will call this function instead of all of them on update. This again is just a preference. You don't need to do this. I just find it looks neater and I like it a lot more. So handle all inputs right there. Okay, cool. Now I'm going to save that. And now right below handle all inputs, I'm going to make a comment for our movement, and then I'm going to make another comment for our actions, just so it's really easy to locate the stuff when we start piling up the inputs in the future, and believe me, they will start piling up. All right, so next I'm going to navigate to my rolling animation. If you have the straight sort pack again, there is a rolling animation there. Here's a preview of it, and if you don't, I'm going to show on screen now a place called Mixamo where you can get some free animations, and I think they have rolling animations. I do believe so. So let's go to the animator window and go to layers. We're going to add a new layer. I'm going to call this action override. What is this? Well, as it suggests, it's going to override the locomotion layer. So let's click this cog icon, put the weight up to 1. That's very important. This means it completely overrides anything that's above it. Let's make an empty state. It's also important that it goes below the base layer and not above it. It needs to be on the bottom, so it overrides everything above. Make sure there's no mask. If there's no mask, it defaults to the whole body. And call your entry state empty, as in nothing is happening, and don't put an animation in it. Next, drag in your animation for rolling and call it whatever you called it in the scripts. I believe I called mine roll_forward_01, so I'm going to call it that. And then make a transition arrow by right-clicking on it and bring it back to the empty state. Click on the arrow, and if you want to, you can see here how it blends back to normal. You can kind of tweak that when you want, where you want the roll to end, I should say. So if I, for example, drag this cursor over here, I can kind of drag this little blue section back, and you can tweak the start and ending of it by using these two little arrows here. But just make that whatever you want it to be in terms of settings. And now if I roll in the game here, it's working fine, awesome, but you can see I can actually spam the roll button really fast, and what happens is I'll keep repeating the action, so it will start and start and start and start again like this, and we don't want that. That's terrible. Basically, we want to make it so when our player attempts an action, they commit to this action and can't do anything else. Now, if we uncomment if player is performing action return and save it and go back to the game, you can see I can roll and I cannot spam the roll button, but I can't roll anymore. Why is that? Well, it's because our bool is never reset to false. You can see here, if I go to the player manager, it is true now. If I uncheck it, I can actually roll again, but then it becomes true. So there's a very simple and effective way to reset these that actually works out perfectly for a project like this. If you go to the empty state in the animator window and add a script to the state itself, yes, you can do that. We can actually call the script reset action flag is what I'm going to call it. I'm sure many of you know about these animator state scripts, but when you basically create a script on top of the state, it auto-populates the script with a few functions that you can use, and I'll show you what one we're going to use. So there's one called onStateEnter, but before we get into that, place in our namespace as it is per tradition, and then erase the comments on override public void onStateEnter so it becomes active, or erase the slashes, I mean. And onStateEnter, as it says, is called when a transition starts and the state machine starts to evaluate the state. That is a fancy way of saying whenever we enter this state, this logic is running basically one time. So let's say if our character is null and make a character manager variable for the character that has this animator, we're going to say character.animator equals getComponentCharacterManager, and it references this animator, which is attached to our player, because every state, animator state, has an animator. So if you go to your player here in your prefabs, you can see there's an animator window here. It just basically references this animator component. Now back into the script, if our character is null, character equals animator.getComponentCharacterManager, and then we're going to say character.isPerformingAction equals false. And just like that, it's so simple. Basically, whenever we play our roll animation, because the transition goes back to the empty state when it has completed, then this logic runs and the character.isPerformingAction flag is reset. And that is such a great way to handle it. So let's save that and minimize the window here and go back to our project. And just to show you, you can see here the roll forward transitions back to the empty state. The script is attached to it, and when it enters, this logic is called onStateEnter. So that is how that works. All right, now let's go into the game. If I roll here, you can see my isPerformingAction is not true. Now it is true, and now it's not true again. So when we roll, it activates during the animation, and then it resets when the animation concludes. And that's why it's really handy to use those on enter or on exit states for stuff like this. It just makes it so much simpler. Now, if we go over to our player locomotion manager, what we want to do, we could do is say if character is performing action return or player, and that would be cool for now. But in the future, that's not going to fly, because we can rotate during certain attack animations and action animations. We can walk during certain item animations, like when you're drinking a flask. So what we want to do is make 2 additional flags. Now, isPerformingAction is good for general actions and use cases, but for specialized use cases, we want to give every, I guess you could say, action its own flag. So, for example, we're going to make a public bool for canRotate and canMove, okay? And we're going to initialize these at true when you start the game. That's important, otherwise you won't be able to move or rotate. Very important. And then what we want to do is go over again to our character animator manager, and on this function, add 2 auto-filled bools here. canRotate, I'm going to initialize that at false, and canMove, I'm also going to initialize that at false. So when I initialize it here, it basically just autofills for me. I don't need to put it in a function, and it will auto set to false. You can edit it by adding it to the function, but it just autofills itself to false. And I'm going to space it out so we can see it, because there's a lot going off the screen right now. And then I'm going to simply say character.canRotate equals canRotate, and character.canMove equals canMove. So much like the performing action bool, we're just setting our character's flags up when we call this function. And now over on the player locomotion manager, I'm going to go to my handle rotation logic, and right at the top of it, I'm going to say if the player can not rotate by using an exclamation mark, I'm going to return. So if we can't rotate, do not run any of this logic. If we go to the handle grounded movement now, I'm also going to say if the player cannot move, then return, exactly the same way. So basically, this lets you set up movement if you want, or rotation if you want, in certain action animations, which is very handy. Okay, now that's good. Let's minimize this, and let's minimize the handle rotation function. Now, if I go over on the reset animator bool, it's the same thing. Just say character.canMove is equal to true, and character.canRotate is equal to true. And there you go. That will reset the flags when you exit an animation action state. And now if we go into the game here, you can see I can't move or rotate while I'm performing a dodge. So that works as intended, and that is awesome. Okay, so that works as intended, but we still have a few things to do. So I'm going to go over now, and I'm going to stop the game, and I'm going to open up the player locomotion manager, and I kind of don't like my walking and running speed. I think they're a little bit too fast. So I'm just going to tweak those. You don't need to spend a whole lot of time on this if you don't want to. I'm just going to quickly throw some numbers in and just make it feel a little bit smoother. And that feels a bit too slow for me, so one more time, there we go. And now if I go into the game, I notice something though. If I roll, I'm running faster after I roll. Now why is this? Well, it's because we didn't reset our apply root motion. And root motion basically takes the movement of your animation and adds it onto your character's movement. So if we combine our character controller movement with the movement of our walking animations, you get this effect where you basically double them up and apply your speed twice over. Now we don't want that. So what you could do is just say apply root motion is equal to false in your new reset animator action script, and that would work out just fine. So you could say character dot animator dot apply root motion is equal to false. That works fine. But I'm going to show you another way too, just because I like showing how to do things in more than one way, and I'll show you the way that I like to do it personally. So let's erase that, and let's go over to the character animator manager. And what you want to do is say character dot apply root motion is equal to apply root motion, and then make a flag for apply root motion over here on your character manager. Okay, and initialize that at false. So we can save that. Now go to your player animator manager, and I'll show you the way I was speaking of just now that I like to do it. Let's make an on animator move function. It should autofill. This is a default function within Unity, and this basically calls this function every single frame an animation state is playing. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to say if the player, so we need to reference our player manager. Let's make a player manager variable up here, call it player, call override awake. We're going to override our awake, keep our base.awake, and then say player equals get component player manager. So we're going to say if player dot apply root motion, what we want to do is copy the motion of our animator window by saying vector3 velocity is equal to player dot animator dot delta position. We then want to move our character controller using that delta position by saying player dot character controller dot move, and we pass our velocity. And then we want to take the rotation by saying player dot transform dot rotation times equals player dot animator dot delta rotation. And that's it. And basically all this does is it takes the movement and the rotation of the animation and applies it. Whoop, that's transform dot rotation, not root. It applies it to your character. So we save that now and we minimize it. If we actually were to go into our animator flag, we want to say character dot apply root motion is equal to false. So that resets that after this this action has been processed. And then we save that. And now if we were to go to the player prefab, you can see that the animator now says handled by script under the apply root motion. There is no more checkbox. It just says this is handled by a script. Now if we go into the game, we can run around. And if we roll, you can see it locks us out of movement and rotation. And then it goes back to our regular movement after the animation has concluded. So if I open the player manager, you can see two bools. We are performing an action and we are applying root motion while rolling. And then when it stops rolling, we go back to not applying root motion and not performing an action. So that is working as intended. Okay, so let's jump over to the player locomotion manager again. Copy player.player animator manager.play target action animation. Paste it where you would play your back step and replace roll forward with back underscore step 01. You can call it whatever you want. That's what I'm going to call it. If you are using our straight sword pack, we do have a backstep animation. If not, you can most likely find one on Mixamo. So I'm just going to do the same thing I did with the roll animation and just basically make it transition back to empty. And that should work as intended. Set the blend the way you want it, and then if we go into the game here now and test this, you can see if I'm stationary and tap the dodge button, I do a backstep just like that. Excellent. And if I am moving, I will perform a roll. Now the problem is if I bring in another client here, you can see I'm performing a roll on the client, but the host slash client on the other side is not seeing it. Likewise, I'm on the host. If I perform a roll, the client that is connected is not seeing it. So we have to sync this action animation, and this works for all action animations, by the way, across the network. We do that by first going to our character animator manager, and we're going to make a comment saying we need to tell the server slash host we want to perform an action animation, and we need to basically allow that server slash host to tell every other client, and we want to make our game object on their end play this action animation. Now every game object has a client ID if it's a player object, and all of your client IDs are unique to your client that is connected. Since the server is also a client himself, he also has his own client ID. So what we want to do is make a thing called a server RPC, and I strongly encourage you to read the documentation. I will link it below on server RPC and client RPC. Seriously, give it a read. If you're not familiar with it, do not move on from this video until you understand what these things do. So I will explain it briefly. A server RPC is a function called from any client, and it is a message from the client to the server authority, hey, I want to do something, basically. So what we're going to do in this function is just we're going to request this server RPC, or rather call this server RPC from our character animator manager whenever we want to play an action animation. And I'm going to call this notify the server of an action animation. And I'm going to make it require a ulong, which is basically how we get our client ID, so the client ID of the character who wants to perform this action. then a string for the animation ID, and then we open up some brackets in here, and we don't need to carry or call rather the can rotate and can move, because again, you're not controlling some other player's movement in your game. That's done on their end. You don't need to basically keep track of these bools. It will be pointless. So let's make a comma and say bool. We do need though apply root motion, because although we do keep our motion synced from the network position, it's also good to apply the root motion from the animation itself, because it makes it look a lot smoother and you won't have animations that are kind of desynced from their movements. So let's then make a client RPC, and under the server RPC, we're going to say if we are the server, we want to run this client RPC. And a client RPC, which we're going to call play action animation for all clients, can only be called from the server, and it is sent to every client present. Okay, so we're going to say ulong client ID, just as we did above. We're going to make it require a string animation ID and a bool apply root motion. So we fire the server RPC, and when the server gets it, we do a check to make sure this is the server. If it is the server, we say play action animation for all clients. We only do this from the server, because if you attempt to run this from a client, you'll get an error. So if this character is the server or host, then we activate their power as the server or host to perform a client RPC. And this client RPC will then be sent to every single client present, which again, we have called play action animation for all clients. I'm going to make a note here just to be clear when we come back to this too. A client RPC is sent to all clients present from the server/host. Okay, so inside here, what do we want to do? Well, first we want to check to make sure that the person sending this animation doesn't play the animation again. We do this by saying if the client ID does not equal network manager.singleton.local client ID, because remember, every player is getting this. So if the player who gets this isn't, we've got to make sure that basically if I send an action animation and I get this client RPC from the server, I don't want to play the animation again because I'm the one who sent it. So we do that by comparing our client ID to our local client ID. And now when I get this, because I sent it, I'm not going to run it twice because I match this client ID. Now, if we don't match the client ID and we're just somebody else present, we want to perform the action animation from the server. And now we get this, and this nice client RPC has passed us the animation ID and the apply root motion bool. So we make the perform action from animation server, or from server, require the animation ID and the apply root motion. And then we simply say down here, character, but before we do that, we need to make a character manager variable up here at the top because we don't have that set up yet. And then we need to make a protected virtual void awake method in case we want to override this in the future on our player or AI manager, network manager. And then we're going to simply say character equals get component character manager. And then down here, we will say character.animator.apply, or sorry, character.apply root motion is equal to apply root motion. And then character.animator.crossfade. And then we pass our animation ID. And we want to use the same crossfade time that we use on our character animator manager class, which is 0.2. That's to make it all look consistent. So you want to keep those values the same if you want it to look more consistent. So again, just character.apply root motion equals apply root motion, and character.animator.crossfade. We pass our ID and 0.2. We make sure we call perform action animation from server, and we pass the animation ID and then the bool for apply root motion. So once again, guys, if you do not understand this, please take the time right now, pause the video, go read the documentation, just sit with it for a moment because it is really important that you grasp this before moving forward. We're going to be using server RPCs a whole lot. Okay, so let's go back to our character animator manager scripts, and right where we made our comment, let's say character.character.network.manager.notify server of action animation. And now we need to pass our client ID. And to do that, we need to make sure we're using the library for that. So up top, we're going to say using unity.netcode, okay? And then right below that, we're going to say network manager.singleton.local client ID. And then we pass our string for our animation. And then we pass the bool for if we're applying root motion or not. So target animation and apply root motion, just like that. And if we save that now, we can minimize this. You'll see you get two errors because although we don't have an error in the code, Unity's netcode requires that we end server RPCs with the prefix server RPC. and client RPCs with the prefix client RPC. So this needs to be done every single time you create a client or server RPC, and this is pretty standard. So let's just fix the names and save that. And now if we go over to the character animator manager, let's just make sure we fix over here too and save that. And now if we save this, minimize it, and go to the game, I'm just going to adjust my window here and hit play. And here I am on the connected client. If I run around and roll, you can see it syncs on the host. Excellent. So animation is syncing perfectly. And now if I go over to my host game, and you can see the host from the client, and I roll, you can see the animation is syncing as intended. All right, there we go. That is very awesome, very satisfying. So that's working as intended. Okay, let's right click and create a new script for our sound effects. I'm going to call mine Character Sound Effects Manager. I'm going to add these in nice and early because I find it really brings the game to life. So I'm going to go to my player's prefab. I'm going to add an audio source component. And on that audio source component, I'm going to come down to a thing called spatial blend and change that from 0 to 1. What does that do? Well, basically, if this is closer to 1, it makes the sound act as if it were in a 3D space. So if you're closer, it's louder. If you're further away, it's lower. And that's what we want for a game like this. And now I am going to go over to my scripts folder, specifically where the player is. I'm going to right click and create a player sound effects manager script. And as is per tradition, I'm going to open up the character and player sound effects scripts, delete the start and update functionalities, and add in our namespace. I am then going to make the player sound effects manager script derive from the base class of character sound effects manager, so it can access all of the functionality of the base class while also having its own individually if it so chooses. Okay, so let's save that now. Now, there are a lot of sounds in the game you're going to use for a lot of your characters. What you could do, and while I'm explaining this too, make sure you declare an audio source variable on the character sound effects manager and call it on awake, make it private because we don't need to access from anywhere. So you could just make a variable for a rolling sound effect on every single player and character that you ever make in the game. But that's a lot of work, so we're going to do it a different way. So let's make a public void, and we're going to call this play sound effects, but specifically we're going to make it play a rolling sound effect because we want to target one specific sound effect. Now, to get this rolling sound effect, we're going to make a new world manager. Let's create an empty game object, reset its position, and I'm going to call this the world sound effects manager, and all shared sound effects will go here so that you don't have to declare them on every single model you make in the game, because when you have 500 enemies, you don't want to drag in a rolling sound effect 500 times. So let's add a script for world sound effects manager, and this is going to be a singleton like all of our other components, or our managers, sorry, that are world managers. So let's make our namespace as is per tradition, and I'm going to make a public static world sound effect manager variable, and I'm going to call it instance. You can call it singleton if you want. I just like using the keyword instance. So I'm going to make an awake method, and I'm going to say if instance is equal to null, instance is equal to this. If not, there is somehow 2 of these in the scene, and that should never happen, so we're going to destroy this game object. Next, we're going to call a start function, and we're going to simply say do not destroy on load. Okay. So we're going to make a variable for our rolling sound effects because this will be shared across many characters. So we can say public audio clip, and then we're going to call it rolling sound effects. You can call it what you want. I'm also going to make a header. I'm just going to call this action sound effects because there's going to be quite a few of these. Think parry, think the riposte noise, all that good stuff. Now back over on our character sound effect manager, we can say audio source dot play one shot. And then we get our singleton of our world sound effect manager by saying world sound effects manager dot instance dot rolling sound effects. Now we need to call this roll sound effects function on a specific frame of our animation. We do that by going to the FBX file of our animation, or the anim file if you have that instead, and then come down to where it says events, and then we want to basically scroll this cursor to where we want it to be. Find the specific frame, hit this plus icon here, and then put in the name of the event. So copy and paste it and click apply. And that's it. Now, if I were to go into my game, well, it wouldn't work actually, because first we need to actually put in a sound effect. So let's go into our art folder, create a new folder for audio, and then create a new folder inside that folder, which I am going to call sound effects. And then I'm going to open the sound effects folder. Not sound, there we go. And I'm going to create a new folder for actions. So action sound effects. And then inside here, I'm going to drop my rolling sound effect. Now, in the World Sound Effects Manager, I'm going to place that right there. And then if we go to our player prefab, or first let's make a prefab of our World Managers, so we have that saved. Drag that in the World Managers folder, and then go to our player prefab and add our player sound effects manager script. And if I start the game now, I'm just going to drag this next to the player animator manager. If I start the game and roll around, I know you guys can't hear it because I'm not recording system audio, but at that specific frame, I'm actually playing the rolling sound effect. You can also come to the audio source here and you can tweak the settings for how far you want this to be heard from. And you can make it non-3D if you want, so it can be heard from everywhere. But I definitely wouldn't recommend it because then you'd hear everything from everywhere all the time. So down here, you can also just kind of mess with the roll-off settings. So basically how loud it is when you're closer or further away. You can do linear or logarithmic. So you can play with that and basically set it up to how you want it to sound. Okay, so this was a request from a couple people. This is how you set up the keyboard and mouse movements on your controller. I'm not going to keep these, but I'll show you how to set them up and I'll show you that they do work. So for your keyboard, it's pretty straightforward. Where we have left stick, just put W, S, and A, D on the up, down, and left and right places. So you want to make sure it says the letter plus the keyboard key or whatever key you want to be in the keyboard to make your character move. You can use the arrows as well. Now for your camera, what you want to do is go to where we have the camera movement. I'm going to make a new one just to show you, but I'll actually revert it later. So make it a pass-through, and you don't want button. You can use a few things here, but what you want to use is the delta. Then go down here on the mouse and just look for mouse bracket delta, okay? So if you were to set this up on the movement key up here, I'm actually going to do it just to show you that it works. Again, over here, go to the top and change it to a pass-through. And then you want to change it to a delta. Down here where I have right stick, I'm going to look, or just delete that entirely and make a new binding and look for the mouse delta. So if I save this now and go into the game and start it, I'm actually moving the camera now with my mouse. You'll find the sensitivity is a little bit different, so you might want to tweak that. And I'm moving around with WASD. So that's pretty straightforward, very simple. Thank you all very much for watching and being here. I hope you are enjoying the series thus far, and I hope you learned something today. Also, a special thank you to my patrons. As usual, you guys are the reason I get to keep doing this, and I appreciate each and every one of you. I know I sound like a broken record once again, but I'm going to ask you to like the video and leave a comment because it does help the series out so much. I'm very excited to start the next episode, so I will see you guys there. Oh, right, and before I go, for those of you who don't know, I actually have a second channel where I post devlogs of my projects, so if you guys want to check that out, I will also leave a link in the description.